So it's my great pleasure to introduce our friend and colleague, Dr. Eric Doucette. Eric is presently the state botanist for the Maine Natural Areas Program, where he conducts field inventories for rare plants, rare and exemplary natural habitats, and he also manages Maine's official list of threatened and endangered plants. Prior to working at Maine Natural Areas Program, Eric taught botany and ecology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts and worked as a consulting botanist for Stantec Consulting. Eric is the well-known president of the Jocelyn Botanical Society, whoop, whoop, and past NEBS council member. Thank you, Eric. And Eric holds a PhD in plant systematics and also a BS in botany from the University of Maine. Oh, blue. Please welcome Dr. Eric Doucette.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good to see you. I recognize a lot of faces. For those of you who are new, who I don't know, it's nice to meet you. So I had always wanted to go to Newfoundland. And my wife, who's sitting in the front row here, Angel, we had taken our kids so many times on vacations far to the south. And we thought nothing of driving several days to go to the Smokies or Florida or something like that. But we really never drove north with them. And so this summer, we had an opportunity to do that. And so this was my first time going to Newfoundland, and certainly not the last. It's a phenomenal place. I would encourage everyone to go. And I will say that preparing this talk was pretty difficult because I had 1,600 photos from 1 week. That does not count about the 800 that I lost on one of the devices. So paring them down, going through them was quite a challenge. It took a lot to organize, but what was nice to do and made me want to go back. So seeing all the photos again this last week it has me itching to go back as soon as I can. So the trip was planned by my friend Roger Rittmaster, who is a retired endocrinologist, but a great naturalist. He's been to Newfoundland several times, and so he had mapped out our whole itinerary for us, which was great because given my position at the state, I didn't have much time to actually do trip planning. So Roger had it all ready to go, which suited us perfectly. So we started out just by driving to Montreal. I will say, if you ever try to fly to Newfoundland and you're not flying to the capital, but you're flying to Deer Lake, where my arrow lands there, the timing is tough. Almost all flights from Canada and the US land in the middle of the night. And I don't know about you, but I don't like night flying. So that's a little bit tricky. Getting there, and it's actually cheaper, or at the time it was cheaper, to fly from Montreal than it was to go to New Brunswick and fly, even though that would have been closer. So all the spots that we went, as we go through the slides, I have indicated by that little magenta circle there on the bottom. So we flew into Deer Lake, which is a small city, certainly small by the standards of Boston. Big by the standards of where I live in Wayne, Maine, where there's no streetlights. But that was our landing base and our starting off point. And one thing that I will mention that is worth looking, if you go home and if you Google on Google Earth, look at the western side of Newfoundland, the area that I'm showing you, and look a little bit inland where we did not go. There are a ton of really phenomenal looking peatlands. So from the aerial, at least, those look like 2 weeks worth of additional botanizing. And many of the large ribbed peatlands that you can see on the aerial are right around the town of Deer Lake. So they're really accessible. Okay, so the first stop where we went, which was about 45 minutes, I think, for travel time from Deer Lake, was the Gross Moor National Park, which has several subunits. And the first subunit that we went to was the Tablelands Trail, which is a really interesting area where the Earth's mantle is exposed, and there are various rates of weathering. So the rocks look completely different from nearby mountains. And because of the chemistry there, of the soil chemistry, the flora is quite different from surrounding areas. So it's a unique flora, and some of our rarest plants in New England are very, very common there. And of course, there's lots of taxa that we don't have as well. So one that we don't have is this one that's on the screen here. If you guys can see me on the screen doing this, but this little anemone is about this tall. So this is Anemone parviflora, about 6 inches tall, a taxon that we don't have in New England. Very, very common on all the limestone barrens on the west coast of Newfoundland. The most common member of the genus there. So if you're not into plants at all, which of course this group doesn't apply, it's still worth going. So just on the raw beauty of the landscape alone, Newfoundland is phenomenal. Some of the spots we went to are probably the most beautiful spots that we have ever been to. And my friend Roger, who's very well traveled, including lots of the tropics, one of the spots I'm going to show you, he says is the most beautiful spot on the planet. And I think we concurred when we saw it. It's just phenomenally beautiful. So Angel here in this scene is just admiring the landscape. At the far sort of receding edge of that photo where the snow is on top of there, there's a much higher elevation that we didn't have time to go to. But again, if you look on Google Earth or look on iNaturalist, you can see there's some cool stuff up there. So there's a lot of small pocket wetlands up there that support a lot of rare sedges. And I had not known that until after we left. Otherwise, I probably would have made a beeline up there. But where we are in these more xeric spots is still pretty phenomenal. So here's just some views of the landscape. The right-hand side, that's Gross Morin off in the distance, Gross Morin Mountain itself off in the distance, which in a straight line is probably only about 20 miles or so from the tablelands. So when we were there, this was June 28th of this year. You can see there's lots of snowpack up at the high elevation and not visible on this shot, but many of them had meltwater streams still coming from them time of year. And there's a lot of rare plants that sort of hug that habitat. I'm no geologist, but a good friend of Roger's was, and he was filling us in on the geology of this area. And so these bedrock types are very high in certain metals, high in magnesium, calcium, copper, silicon, moderate amounts of iron, low in phosphorus. So they're challenging for plants to grow. And so it's called a serpentine flora, much like you might find in other Western US, for example, in terms of the plant response. The rocks that you're seeing, this brown rock here. Oh, good, that pointer does work. So the color of that rock has to do with the small amounts of iron that are present. And when it oxidized, and the rocks were formed between 1200 and 1400 degrees Celsius. But many of them, if you flip them over, you can see the unweathered face, which is a completely different color, almost an olive green color, the bands of serpentinite that run through it. It's quite pretty. It's somewhat, I wouldn't say treacherous, but it is a little tricky walking up these side slopes. You can do it though, and there are some sort of social trails that go up to the top of these. So one of the plant families that really does well on this bedrock type is the Caryophyllaceae, the carnation family. And there are many genera and many different species that we saw throughout our trip. This was just one of the first ones that was a new taxon to me. This is Silene suicea, the old Viscaria suicea. And this plant mostly was gone by at this site, but there were a few individuals like this one that were still sort of in prime flower. So you can see that this species is dioecious, so staminate and carpellate individuals are separate. And like many of our Caryophyllaceae around here, it has this accrescent sepal, these little sacs of connate sepals of the calyx that sort of inflate around the developing capsule. One of the challenging things that I learned too late when I went there was what to use for flora. As far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there's no published paper copy that's current for the flora of Newfoundland. So what I had done is I had gone to this site, which is an excellent site, by the way. So I strongly recommend if you're trying to learn the flora of Newfoundland, or if you're trying to go there, this site is a great resource. They have keys, not for all taxa yet, still in progress, as well as the full checklist of the flora and excellent photography. But I had downloaded some of the keys, like the one for Salix, on a smaller phone than this. And I had printed a few things out, and I had Gray's manual 8th edition, which for those of you who have used it, you might know there's lots of great information in there, but the print is really small. So on cloudy days, that was challenging. And just trying to look at your phone, a key on a phone, for me, with my eyesight, wasn't great. So if you go, I would strongly recommend downloading and making into a book form the keys of taxa of your particular interest. Well worth doing ahead of time. One of the plants that was everywhere on the tablelands was a plant that I noticed from horticulture, Armeria. And to be honest, when I worked at a greenhouse years ago, we sold this. It's a common garden plant. I never really looked that closely at the flowers. They're structurally pretty amazing. So if you can see in here, let's see if we can find one at the right stage. So right in here, where the pointer is, that's the developing corolla. So the petals collectively still all fused together, sitting inside the connate calyx. So the sepals are fused into this papery ring on the outside, the sort of pale pink whitish structure, and inside is the developing corolla. Subtending each one of those are all these papery bracts. So there's a lot going on. It's actually quite architecturally interesting. So this trip for me really allowed me to spend some time to take photos of plants that I might normally just walk by, like even some taxa that are common for us in Maine or New England, like this Juncus Balticus. And I say complex here because there's a lot going on in the Juncus Balticus complex. There are subspecies, varieties, species, depending on how you treat them, and differences in taxonomic opinion. I guess I'll just say that. The other thing that caught my eye up there were two taxa often growing together in the Tophieldiaceae. So each of these genera, Tophelia and Triantha, they each have 3 species in North America, so 6 species total. And I'm sure you all probably know, at one point, they were all lumped into Tophelia. So Triantha was Tophelia, at least for our North American material. And they were, go back a little bit further, they were all in the Liliaceae, the lily family. But at first glance, they look quite similar. But Triantha glutinosa, which we have in New England on the right, has these obvious glandular stems, and Tophelia does not. In addition, for our eastern taxa, Triantha glutinosa has bracts and bracteoles. Other Trianthas do not, they just have one. And in Tophelia, it's the opposite. So the one that we have in eastern North America, in this case Newfoundland, has, sorry, I said that backwards. It has bracteoles, but no bracts subtending the petals, which the other 2 Tophelia in North America, one is northern and one is southeastern, they have both structures. So that was kind of cool to see both of those plants side by side. Tophelia was new to me. Tophelia pusilla was new to me. Does not occur in East North America. So one of New England's rarest plants was all over the place at the tablelands. So Adiantum eluticum, the western maidenhair fern, which is this very upright habit that you see here. And I have this picture on the left, far left here, of our common maidenhair fern compared to eluticum on the right. This one's from Maine. on the left, on the far left, this one is from the Newfoundland trip. So just to kind of show you the comparison in the shape of the ultimate leaf segments there. But there were probably tens of thousands of Adiantum illicitum there.
Eric, have you seen that in New England?
Yes, it's in Maine, Maine and Vermont. Very rare. Maine, we have one. There's two populations. One we can't access. One of the things that always interests me about places, when you, especially now in the days of iNaturalist, if you look at all the postings from iNaturalist for the tableland, there are several dozen Betula pumila there. I'm not saying it's not there. The plants that I observed had these really strong ascending lateral bracts and leaf size of Betula gland. Singly serrate, the only Betula that has that character state. There are a few postings of that, ton of pumila. So I think someone just said pumila and everyone else jumping on the bandwagon. But that was abundant there. And the first photo that I showed, where it showed the low shrub in the foreground, a lot of that was Betula glandulosa. So the other thing that I took some time to do was take photos of taxa that are common in Maine. And so this Vaccinium uliginosum fits that bill. I walk by this all the time doing surveys. And because I'm looking for taxa that are rarer by Maine standards, I didn't have great photos of the species. So I really used this trip to take some time to do that and try to take time to show the diagnostic characters for the taxa when I did that. Right alongside that was Scripoidea, which actually is rare in the New England states that it occurs. It's Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont for that taxon. Those are both very common there. So I'm a willow geek. Some of you might know this. Willows were probably my primary focus of the trip. I really wanted to see willows that were new to me. And all of these, well, not all of them, but almost all of the dwarf Arctic ones were of that type. So this species was new. We saw this, just a few individuals at the tableland site and scattered throughout the rest of the trip, but it was never the dominant willow. Kind of had to look for it. But it has these characters of young leaves having hairs on both surfaces, the leaves being deciduous, undersurface being glaucous, and very small capsules here, but very densely tight pubescence on those capsules. And I love the common name, beautiful willow. So the next day, we went to Grossmoor Mountain proper, really with no idea of how far we were going to go upslope. And here's just a view looking from the trail back towards the tableland across the bay. And it was beautiful, very nice hiking. But a lot of it was, Roger and I felt, was pretty similar to habitats that we see in Maine. So there was that playing in our background, in our minds, that we were seeing things that were beautiful, but not taxa that were new to us. And also about this spot in the trail, the black flies were really, really thick. And we met a couple of young women who came up who were wearing, we were all in long sleeves. They had shorts and t-shirts, and they wanted us to take their photo. And the whole time they were doing this, like slapping off bugs. So we figured with the black flies and just a similarity to Maine's flora, we would just backtrack, which we did. But again, it still allowed me to get some nice photos of plants that I usually just walk by and say, that's pretty. So I took a bunch of diagnostic photos of some of Maine's common taxa, which I didn't have in my photo files. So including this Linnea. So that same day, because we came down the mountain, we bumped over to this little pina colada imbibing spot here. just up the road. This is called the Coastal Trail, still part of Grossmore National Park, physically separate from the mountain trail, but just one of the disconnected properties that they have. And it was a really nice location. It reminded me a lot of some of the coastal peatlands that we get in down East Maine and some of the ones that are in New Brunswick. So they're basically these coastal domed peatlands that go right up to the ocean. So in a few cases, in a few spots, I should say, the ocean actually is eroding the peatland. So I'm standing here about 20 feet with the ocean behind me. This peatland was large enough that it had a lot of ponds within it. And one of the things that caught my eye, I don't know if you can see this, it's not labeled. This plant in the foreground, that's all Sanguisorba canadensis. That's an S1 for Maine. So one of our rarest plants. In current times, extant populations are mostly on the St. John River. This plant was everywhere in Newfoundland. So it was in really nice pristine habitats. It was also a roadside ditch. It was probably one of the most common plants that we saw. I just kept marveling at how abundant it was when I actually spent survey time in Maine looking for this taxon. The other thing that was really interesting there is because of the high wind speeds, it produces these stunted forests that are called tuckamores. We started calling them tuckaways. But you can see that there's a little social trail through here. And I went in here, I had to duck. So this where my cursor is probably 3 feet. Great spot for kids. Almost all balsam fir. So these really old, like large diameter, but stunted balsam fir trees. So I took a lot of flack for my interest in dandelions on the trip, because I started noticing this dandelion at this site. So what I want to draw your attention to is look how hairy the stem is over here. So that pubescence is pretty dense. Also, look how fleshy the caliculi are. I didn't think too much of it. I thought it was different. Snapped a few photos. Roger made fun of me. Said it's a dandelion. Let's go. And then we had some taxa, which are not necessarily rare in Maine. Here on the left, Carex nigra, which is common in down East Maine. And then Limniris hookeri, the old Iris hookeri, Iris setosa, which is rare, but not one of our rarest. That was very common and abundant in this habitat. One of the things that is new, and I think could be hiding out in extreme northwestern Maine, is this Chamaepericlinum suicium. So notice that it differs from canadensis, our common species, and that the petals of the flower are pigmented dark purple. Bracts are still white, but the small flowers in the center are purple. It differs in size and some other characters too. But that was literally lawns of that taxon there. Orchids were very abundant, and so this habitat was no different. There were hundreds of Arethusa bulbosa in bloom there. So a New England rarity, which for them is fairly common. Carex limosa, which by Maine standards is not rare, but it's a cute sedge, so I couldn't pass up the photo. I had to take it. And then one of our cotton sedges, which is also not rare in Maine, but another great example of, I didn't have a photo of one of the diagnostic characters, which I'm not sure if you can see in the room or not. I will try to put cursor there for a second, cursor there, and a cursor there. What I want you to notice is that mid vein, it does not go to the apex of the scale. It fades out before the scale apex. That's one of the characters for this species. And I just didn't have that photo. So just trying to beef up those diagnostic photos that I had. This is a good chance to do that. This species was everywhere. So Salix candida, it's very, very rare in Maine, S1. It's a calciophile, it's in fens. It was the most common willow along that western corridor in Newfoundland. In habitats like this, very nice pristine habitats, but again, also you could just see thousands of stems. Some primulas there in abundance, although they were most common right along the trail edge where everyone was walking, so they were getting trampled a little bit. But Primula laurentiana was in prime bloom, and we saw this elsewhere. The largest populations, the most robust individuals that we saw are our trip were hundreds of them. Anyone seen this one before? So this was just sort of serendipitous. This plant is very small. You can see by my ring over here is 5 millimeters. So I was actually sitting down to photograph something else, set my camera and hand down, and then saw this Flagellinoides here. This is, again, is a rare taxon for New England. It was fairly abundant in open, high pH peatlands or peatland edges in Newfoundland, which we did not explore a lot of because we were mostly in the Barrens. So this area was unique in the fact that it had Barrens nearby, but then it had this really nice peatland right next to the ocean. So it had the best of 3 possible worlds, basically. We then jumped up to Cow Head. It was a really foggy morning. And you can see, I don't know if you noticed, the first day we were in t-shirts. And so now we're the last of June, and I think I have 2 sweatshirts on underneath this. Starting to get a fair amount colder as we go north. Geology here was amazing. So, and I imagine that geologists also must love the western corridor, western edge of Newfoundland, because the rock formations as well as the rock chemistry are phenomenal. I had probably, and Angel probably had more, a couple hundred photos of rocks. Just cool rocks, cool designs. So one of the plants that was very abundant there, which caught my eye right off, was Shepherdea canadensis. We have one population of this in Maine, and that one population consists of one staminate individual, which has been there for several decades. It's a little suspect in the fact that it's alongside an old railroad bed, so it's probably how it got there. But that individual is going nowhere in terms of genetically. It's got no partner. And the species is also in western Vermont. But there, it was one of the most common shrubs from here, Cowhead, to the north. I didn't see it south of here, but you can see really well these peltate scales that the whole family has. And in this case, they're even on the fruit. Lots of orchids. All the ones that were white and in flower didn't come out too great on my camera. I think because the combination of the reflectance of white flowers and the rainy weather, but there were a lot in flower. Aquilonis and Hironensis were by far the most common orchids that we saw in all the sites that we went to. So this was a really neat, completely new genus, not just a new species, but a new genus to me. I'd never heard of this. Cochlearia tridactylides. It's called scurvy grass. It's edible, and presumably it prevented scurvy. I assume it's high in vitamin C. And I tried it, and it just tastes like a salty lettuce or a salty asparagus, something like that. I wouldn't eat a lot of it, but it's quite pretty, and it grows in abundance in really thin soils on the top of these limestone balls, like the areas that have like these rounded rocks and thin soil over that. There's quite a bit of it there. Couldn't pass up seeing Salix candida again. I think I had 100 photos of just one species. It's kind of overkill, I realize, very photogenic. But also there in abundance was Distorta vivipara, which is rare for New England. Not so here. Very common taxon there. Very small, easy to overlook. It's about 4 inches tall. So it's growing in the grasses and sedges here in this headland. So had it not been in flower, you could probably walk right by this without seeing it. Lots of Oxytropis terranovii there. So that's rare in New England under a new name. So that's Oxytropis campestris, for those of you who know the old name. In prime flower. I'm skipping, obviously, tons of taxa at each of these sites just because we only have a limited amount of time. And it's things that caught my eye that were interesting. So this next stop, Bell Burns Barrens, it's really the first of the real Barrens habitat. So if you look on a guidebook to the limestone barrens of Western Newfoundland, for example, this is a well-known one. It's often mentioned. There are quite a few taxa there, but I think being the southernmost barrens, it gets a lot of destructive use. There's lots of four-wheeler use there. Cars can drive right out there. And I will say that that is the case with a lot of these barrens, is that the enforcement of protection, I think, is difficult. So they get a lot of use, which is not ideal for a lot of these plant taxa. And we did see that here. Including, I should say, botanists, when we all visit, have to keep in mind where we go as well, where our impact is. So one of the plants that I see fairly frequently in northern Maine, but it's rare for us on the St. John River, is this species, Erigeron hysalpifolius. But because I'm surveying for other taxa that bloom later in the year, I'm always seeing this in fruit, never in flower. So it was really nice on this trip to see this repeatedly flowering. So for those of you who have been there, you know this already. For those of you who haven't, this might surprise you. But one of the most common roadside plants, like literally in the roadside ditches in the northern half of the western side of the peninsula, is Cypripedium parviflorum. By the tens of thousands, hyper abundant. The labellum is still almost a normal size, not quite as large as New England specimens, but still fairly large. But the plant stature, they can be blooming when they're 2 inches tall. The tallest ones we saw, I don't think were over a foot, probably like 8 or 10 inches. But we saw many that were 2 to 6 inches full bloom. And we took a zillion photos of them. Okay, so one of the spots we were most looking forward to was this Flowers Cove North, because here's where willow diversity starts kicking in. You start getting more and more abundance of willows, but also more diversity of species. So it's a fairly unique area in terms of the abundance and distribution of limestone. Our first spot that we went, though, as I said, we parked at a church, an old cemetery, and as the slide showed, it was very foggy. And Angel walked from like where she is now to the outside the room and gone. And so when the three of us physically separated, it was very difficult to know where the person was. And when we drove away, we saw that there was a house that was right there. We didn't even know we were by someone's house. It was so foggy that almost all the photos just are blurry. So I only got a couple of good shots of things that were new to me there. One of them was another Caryophyllaceae. There were several Stellaria up there. This Stellaria longipes, subspecies longipes, was abundant from this spot north to the very tip of the northern peninsula. But this was the first spot that I had picked it up. I heard some of you talking earlier about rubus. There's some interesting rubus. So this Rubus arcticus, which by most accounts is the sister species to our native New England Rubus pubescens, was abundant. Much larger flowered, and from this shade that you see on the screen to almost red. Very, very dark pink was the norm. The leaves are much more leathery than pubescence. The petals are larger. Down here, this basal part of the petal that becomes a claw is more pronounced and exaggerated than it is in pubescence, for those of you who know that species. And again, it was new to me, but at the first coastal trail that I showed, I had seen some plants that I thought were this taxon, but once I started seeing this, I thought they were probably hybrids between the two. And there is a named hybrid between the two species. That's actually fairly common in Newfoundland. None of these were, we didn't find any in fruit to be able to taste, unfortunately. Lots of Rhodiola rosea. So again, a rare taxon by New England standards, very, very common in Newfoundland. And at this site, this photo doesn't really show it this well because it's well vegetated, but most of this site had very loose, like limestone pavers. So almost like walking over loose bricks. But so as you walk, the whole substrate is kind of moving, especially towards the ocean. But rhodiola was growing fine in this sort of condition. This particular spot I took because it had this really nice bed of Impetrum and more Shepherdea. So here it was not a tall shrub, it was a ground cover. So just because of the high extreme wind velocity, these shrubs are pruned back and they become horizontal. Some of the junipers up there, they're completely flat on the ground and they're hundreds of years old. So really old specimens with large, I guess DBH isn't the right word, but if you translated DBH diameter to a horizontal, large diameters, but just flat, several inches tall at most. Perfect. So we went just over the other side of the road, basically, just a short hop up, and the weather changed. It was still cloudy, but it was foggy, less foggy, so photos came out really nicely there. And this was, it's called White Rocks, and it's an area of really unique geology. And they're called clints and grikes, which means the clints are the rocks or the rock tops, and the grikes are all these cracks between the rocks. So some of these cracks are quite large. In fact, you could get down in some of them, they're so big. And a lot of the plants, especially some of the willows and other shrubs, that they'll become larger there. So they're very abundant growing down in these grikes. Not much on top of the surface, but if you look down in the cracks, lots of vegetation. This is probably less than a mile, I think, in a straight line from the ocean's edge. So still pretty windy here. And of course, we're getting higher in latitude as well. Who knows this plant? Invicula. Seen this one in New England? We have one spot of this in Maine. One spot. This was a lawnweed, essentially, Newfoundland. As it says here, think of your lawn in the spring when viola is abundant in your lawn edge. That's what Invicula was like here, just everywhere. Probably on the edges of the limestone, so where bare rock met any sort of soil, this plant grew in abundance by the thousands. For those of you who don't know, it's an insectivorous plant. All right, back to the cool stuff. So it turns out that this dandelion, which we were seeing everywhere and we were trying to ignore, is actually a native taxon. So what caught my eye about this species were the things that I showed you earlier, those couple traits. The hairs here, you can see it better in the central photo. So the persistent peduncle hairs, really thick, fleshy caliculi. And look up here where the cursor is. See that horn? So those projections on the filaries or the involucral bracts are very pronounced in this taxon. Other Taraxacum have those as well, not to this extent. So depending upon your taxonomy and nomenclature, this is either Taraxacum ceratiforum, as the screen says, or Taraxacum longii, which might be a Newfoundland segregate from this species, which is mostly more western on the continent. But it was huge. You can see here the size of this capitula in my hand. I took, I don't know, 20 photos of this dandelion. Everyone was laughing at me. But to me, it shows you that your biases cause you to overlook things. And I said this at botanical meetings before, and I was guilty of it because I realized when I got home and I was keying it out for all my photos, see the edge of here, of this colliculus, how it's hyaline, it has a little thin see-through edge on the colliculi border. Well, one of the things in the Taraxacum key for the key of North America refers to that character state. And I have no idea if the common lawn dandelion has that. Because I didn't look, I'm overlooking it because I'm biased, right? So it was a good reminder to look at everything, even things that at first glance we might want to walk by. Not from dandelions, back to willows. So this particular site was loaded with salix. And my favorite salix of the trip had to be the Salix vestita. This was the first site that we had seen it. Might have overlooked it before just by not being in proximity, but it was from here north, it was very, very common. So a couple of the characters of this, and this individual down here growing in the Grike is 2 or 3 feet tall. So it's not prostrate on the ground like a lot of those Arctic willows are. It's a shrub, but it's a small shrub. The biggest one that I saw in a sheltered location was probably 5 feet tall. But even small specimens that are in the wind-blown areas have these really large terminal buds. The largest terminal bud of any of the shrub willows in Newfoundland. So quite distinctive, but you don't even need that because look at the leaves. The leaves are strongly rugose, adaxially, think rugosa rose. And then abaxially, this picture over here, the veins stick out at you on the lower surface. Revolute margin, persistently hairy abaxially throughout the growing season. So not just young leaves, they'll retain those hairs. And it's cute, right? Nice willow. Also, so there was Artophila, Candida, planifolia, reticulata was here, and I think Arctica was here. They wouldn't all fit on my screen. So here's Salix Artophila, which is rare in New England. So for us in Maine, this is Katahdin. New Hampshire, the White Mountains, pretty common in Newfoundland. One thing we do not have currently in New England is the genus Dryas. However, if you know Mount Greylock in Massachusetts, this plant was abundant there about 15,000 years ago. So when the glacier left Greylock, and then by extension, all the mountains in New England, this plant was the common pioneer there. It's very common in our subfossil record in New England. Okay, so one of the things, how many of you know Primula mystacinica? So it's our, in quotes, common Primula of New England. It's rare, but when I go to the St. John, it's everywhere. So it's locally common, even though it's a rare taxon in the state of Maine. But it has a very close look-alike in Newfoundland. And mystacinica does occur in Newfoundland. But the one that looks most like it is this Primula egalixensis, which was abundant and blooming throughout the northern half of the peninsula. So it differs in flower size. So its flower is smaller. Its corolla width across tops out at about 8, sometimes 10 millimeters. So mystacinica can be bigger. It's always white. Mystacinica can be multicolored. But then down here on the leaves, notice that it has this somewhat well-defined petiole below the leaf blade proper. Mrs. Seneca has a much fatter petiole that basically just looks like the leaf just gave up. It just ends. There's no defined petiole there. And these were all growing on top of the rock in 2 millimeters of soil. So from there, we did a lot on those 2 days, a lot of small side trips. We went to Sandy Cove, which again is a preserve. A lot of these oceanside barrens do receive protection, but they also are open to the public in all manners. So people do still drive vehicles here, even though the signs say you can't. There's no one preventing them from doing that. So probably the largest threat to these limestone barrens are humans and vehicle traffic that humans use on those areas. So this was this. I don't know if you can see it on the sign back here. Yes, you can. One of the signs says when you come into the town, it's a very small town, but there's a sign right along the major road that says "Home of Longs Brea," and it's well known. So it's a global endemic that's restricted to the northern half of Newfoundland on the west edge only. So it's very, very narrowly distributed. However, it's well known botanically. So that's why a lot of these early botanists were traveling to this part of the country, North America, to see these taxa that are such narrow endemics. So if you look at the key in Gray's 8th edition, one of the things that separates it, there's a very, very subtle leaf shape difference, which I could not see. There is corolla length, and then there is stem pubescence. So Brea longii, which is supposed to be what's common and abundant at this site, is supposed to be glabrous or subglabrous, and Brea fernaldii has abundantly hairy peduncles. I don't know if you can see this or not, but it's fairly hairy. So I was sort of at a loss to know what to call some of these individuals. There were research tags near a lot of them that said B.L. and a number. So someone's been monitoring, the Brea longii there, and I assume they know better than me. This is my first time with this taxon, but using the keys to that exist, it's somewhat difficult to get a satisfactory answer to these two taxa. Lots of Pyrola acerifolia in 2 different habitats. Here on these really dry, barren edges, but then also in spots where we might see it in New England, spots that are more peaty and more hydric. We did see it a lot there, but it was pretty bimodal. Didn't see it in between. So my second favorite willow, if I had to choose, was Salix reticulata. So this is the part of Newfoundland where this starts to become really abundant. And we did see this sulfa here, but kind of sporadic, not a lot of it. When you get to this point, almost to the northern tip of the peninsula, it's almost a lawn in certain areas. The one that I'm holding on the left, those leaves are fairly large for that species. So this, I forget what they call them, the loonies, the Canadian dollars. This is either a Canadian dollar or $2 coin. I can't remember which, but the coin is a little bit larger than our silver dollar. They are for size, and there are probably 200 leaves in that photo. And that individual could be hundreds of years old. Some of these had very, very dense and relatively large diameter stems. But this one is a lot like Vestida at first glance, other than size. So we have that same reticular rugose pattern, but this one is glabrous on the underside. So no hairs like we saw in Vestida. Much shorter petioles, shorter everything. Shorter carpellate spikes, all 9 yards. But when they grow side by side, their color is also different. So reticulata is quite dark green, as you can see here. And vestita often was, when a lime starts to go bad in your fridge, that sort of green color. And we saw some more Caryophyllaceae, this Arenaria hemifusa, which was growing in very, really tight clumps, fairly abundantly. Another willow. I told you I was really geeking out about willows. This one was also new to me. This one was, I thought, unique because it's one of the dwarf willows in stature. But one of the unique characters, you can see it right here with the cursor, for its small size, it had really large, prominent, persistent stipules. A lot of these Arctic dwarf willows, they're either estipulate or they possess them, but it's hard to see. They're tiny. This different. So Salix calcicola, oh, sorry, I'm missing a second. Yeah, I'm missing a C there. Sorry about that. This one has persistent stipules that are very, very large. Both surfaces quite hairy, and this truncate or subcordate base, often very apple-like in appearance, the leaves, hence one of the common names, the apple-leaf willow. You can see over here, maybe this bears discussion or explanation, but so where my cursor is on the upper right, the capsule surfaces themselves are glabrous, which is important because a lot of the other willows have hairy capsules. All these hairs that you see interspersed here, they're arising from the axis of the carpulate ament. So they subtend, if you will. If my left hand is the hairs, my right hand is the capsule. They subtend them. And they're very, very hairy. You have to sort of move them aside to verify that the capsules themselves are glabrous. At first glance, you might say that's very hairy. And then of course down here, this one is actually dispersing seeds already. This was for me, a one plant stop. It was not a gravel pit, but it's a rock pit up the road that had Salix planifolia growing in it, which we have, I won't say abundant, but somewhat common on Katahdin, between 3,500 and 4,500 feet. Rare species for us still, but in Maine, if we're gonna see it, that's where it is. And you can find it around pond shores and the edges of slopes in Katahdin. But there, it was fairly common along old borrow pits, road edges, hydric little pools. It has some characters. It's often very glossy in both the foliage and the branchlet. So the growth of the current year is often quite glaucous. It can start out pubescent. That's what's tricky about that species. But the hairs will quickly fall off and usually be very nicely glaucous. So you rub it with your thumb, like you rub an apple, and that glaucescence comes off. One of the things that's worth noting in this picture on the lower left and the picture on the upper right, look at the abundance and the spacing of the secondary veins. So in some floras, this taxon keys out with Salix discolor, one of our most common willows, and actually does grow with it in certain parts of the world. But the spacing and the regularity of veins on planifolia is much greater. There's more veins and they're closer together and they're more regular than discolor. Also notice the entire margin. So discolor typically has a few teeth. All right, so Asteraceae wasn't actually a large focus of our trip, but just because we didn't see that many taxa that were new to us, but we did see this one, which is globally rare. It's an endemic to Newfoundland and Southern Labrador. It's an Antenaria that has long, skinny leaves. So think of all the Antenarias that you know from our part of the world. They do not have this really elongated leaf shape. So their leaf shape on this species is similar to the bracts on the peduncles of our species. And this right here, in this image, is a bract. But notice something else that differs between this species and our common ones. The bracts are more leaf-like. The gradation between what's a true leaf and what's a bract is less in this species. So similar morphology and elongated on the stem. And growing right with it was the Salix calcicula. And this was literally just an unplanned stop. We were driving by right on the side of the highway. We saw expansive, just limestone rock flat with some pools. And as far as I know, there's no name to this spot. It just looks inviting. And so we pulled over and botanized, and there were tons of cool stuff there. And that's what most of Western Newfoundland is. You don't have to go to all these named places necessarily to see these taxa. Many of them are growing alongside the road. And I don't think I saw a single posted sign in Newfoundland. There's a great, just a public norm of access for all. Okay, so probably the crown jewel of the trip in terms of diversity of taxa and abundance of those species was Burnt Cape. We stayed up there for 3 days in the small town of Raleigh. We stayed in a little cabin, which was really nice. And we met some locals and had a good time. And this ecological reserve is half a mile drive maybe from the town proper. But the town is so small, it's on the ocean, you can look over and see the Cape from your lodging. So some of you may know that a few years ago, by US standards, this largely Western taxon was discovered in northern Maine, one location. It's on Doucette Mountain, which is pretty far up near the St. John River. And that's it for all the eastern US. But if you go north into Quebec, it becomes more common. And we saw a lot of this Saxifraga cespitosa there. So Burnt Cape had many Saxifragas, not just this species, but this species was there in abundance. Most of it we didn't catch at peak flower, but there were some individuals that we did. And what I hope you can see in the room is on this leaf that I've taken off, the abundant stipetate glands. Hopefully you can see that back in the room. That's one of the characters of this taxon. I should say that Angel was going off by herself. Why Roger and I would just spend forever looking at a willow or something. And so Angel found a lot of these rare species just because she was faster than us. She was out looking at the landscapes, taking photos. And so she would come back and show us, and we'd run up and try to see what she found. So she was like scouting out all the sites for us, which was really nice. But here are some more species in the genus that were there. Saxifraga paniculata, one subspecies we have in New England. It's rare, common here. So this is one of the lime encrusting saxifrages. So if you look at the leaf tips, it has hydrophodes that transport water through guttation, the morning water, and it excretes minerals through those hydrophodes, calcium being one of them. But that species, it's all three of these photos on the right. And then down on the lower left here, it has stipetate glandular peduncles. This one on the top was the first time we had seen it in flower. We've been looking for several days at this Saxifraga, just in foliage, no flowers anywhere. This was the first site that we're able to catch this taxon blooming. And it was, once we saw it, we found it quite abundantly the next few days. But our timing was such, so this is, I think, July 1st now. Our timing was such that we were just coming into these northern populations and had just missed the ones to the south. So if anyone knows, in New England, we have a rare Arnica, Arnica lanceolata, which does not occur in Newfoundland. I'm surprised by that, but they do have 4 arnicas there. And one of them, at least, I think Briscoe's is globally rare. I think 3 of the 4 are regionally rare. This one was, I wouldn't say abundant. We probably saw 10 to 20 clumps total on Burnt Cape of Arnica longifolia. Lots of Galliaris rotundifolia growing with juniper. So for those of you who know this from New England, it's a fen species. Here, it's growing up through the stems of common juniper. Very strange. Some potentillas that were there. There's Potentilla nivea, which has these really densely tomentose abaxial surfaces of the leaves. And one that looks a lot like it, but it's glabrous, was Potentilla cransii. And those are both fairly common and in perfect flower at the time we were there. How are we doing on 6:30? So this is the spot, Trina's Cove, where Roger had said was the most beautiful spot that he had been on the planet. So we really wanted to go there. And we concurred. So I'm not sure if it was bad or not. At the time, we felt it was unfortunate the sun wasn't out. It was a foggy day. But in retrospect, it felt appropriate for the time and place. So I think I'm sort of okay with it being foggy that day. But just the landscapes and the vistas from this northern part of the peninsula on this cove were phenomenal. Lots of these really deeply embedded coves, each with their own little headland, all covered with rhodiola rosea. Lots of little rocky islands, a few picturesque houses that we went by. Just incredibly beautiful. But here's one of those little rocky promontories. You can see down here, this is all rhodiola, undoubtedly being inundated or at least splashed by salt spray at times. There were some taxa here that I again, which were not necessarily uncommon in Maine, like Oreojuncus trifidus. Walk by that every time I do a Baxter survey. Didn't have great photos. So I took some photos of it with prime open flowers. And you probably can't see, I could see it when it was on full screen, but look closely right here along the leaf edge. One of the characters that separates this from Juncus in the strict sense is it has finely cerulate leaf margins, which you can feel with your fingers. If you rub it, you can feel like these little tiny teeth is an exaggeration, but these very minute cerulations. And when I blow this picture up on my screen at home, I can actually see them, which I cannot see with my naked eye. So nice to get the photo. Tons of the northern dwarf dogwood again. The name is so long it won't fit on one line. Periclinum swissium. Caryxotratiformis. This was the first spot I had seen it on this trip. I looked, there are lots of collections from northern Newfoundland along the whole western edge. I just hadn't run into it until Trina's Cove. But that's a rare one for us. Leaving there, I knew that Newfoundland had a lot of cotton sedges, which we have, and I had basically given up on seeing any because we hadn't seen any. The ones we had seen were our common species. Like in that first coastal trail that I showed you, that's a species that I see in every peatland I go into. So I had sort of forgotten about them. But then this was alongside the road. So we literally just drove by this really nice small peatland that had thousands of stems of Eriochum russeolum, which is just a phenomenal tawny color. So here's some close-ups of that. Okay, so the last, I'm obviously showing fewer plants per site because they are duplicating more. We're seeing more and more of the same taxa. The last spot we went to was Cape Norman. This was the northernmost spot that you can go without getting in the water. It's about the same latitude as Southern Ireland. But if you think about southwestern Ireland, they can grow some subtropical plants there. You cannot do that at Cape Norman. It was beautiful and sunny, but you cannot be there without wearing a hat. So July 3rd, there was an iceberg floating by, and we had all our layers and a winter hat on. And we were comfortable, but you needed all those layers to be so. Angel actually stuck her feet in the water just to say she had done it. I did not do that. Scientifically interesting on the trip, this probably took the cake. So for those of you who know willows, they're dioecious, right? So staminate individuals are just that. One plant is a staminate individual, another plant is a carpet individuals. This particular clump caught my eye because of its form. It was clearly a hybrid with Vestida and something else. I think Arcticus, but I'm not sure. But when I looked closer, I saw that a bunch of the catkins, the flowering aments, had both sexes. They had stamens and carpels, which I had never seen in any willow before. It's just crazy. So that sort of made my day just by itself, just scientific interest. Now I need to go back and find out what the other parent was. So in the interest of time, I skipped through the next few days. Our return trip saw a lot of the same plants here and here. And then down here in this lower spot, Baker's Brook, which I would highly recommend you go to. It's phenomenal. It has a beautiful waterfall site, but it's mostly a wooded fen, which has a lot of the same species that we would find here, including showy lady slipper. We went back the very last night. We went down to Deer Lake, which is a public beach, and they had a little cookout spot there. And we got some local beer and watched the weather coming in, and then got up really, really early to fly home to Maine. Okay, think I made it time on. Any questions? Yes.
Did you see any of the fun Botriciums up there?
I did see a Botricium, so I think it's Botricium spatulatum, actually. I didn't include it in my talk because I was not sure, but I did see some. Yeah, on Burnt Cape.
Your photos are amazing, particularly the lighting and the detail. I wonder what your camera set up.
The question was, what was my camera set up? The shortest answer is it's just an Olympus Tough TG5. It's the most money that I want to take in the field because I break things a lot. It's a $500 camera, but when you get there's a $20 extension you can get for a light ring, and the beauty of that is you can take the camera and you can set it on your object with no airspace, and still take a photo. But like compositionally, like I don't know enough about what makes a good photo. Honestly, my approach is I take 50, and there's one or two that I'm happy with. I wish I knew more about what makes a good photo. I have a hard time recreating like a photo of mine that I think is good. Like, how do I do it again? It often is just kind of happenstance, honestly.
Eric, we have a lot of activity in the Zoom chat, but I'm just going to grab a couple questions. What flora did you use to identify the willows, and what are the best dates to go?
So for the willows, I used the website that I had shown, the Digital Flora of Newfoundland, which I can share this talk with anyone who wants. Just reach out to me. I can send a PDF to you. I had actually printed out. No, I didn't. I wish I had printed that out. I had downloaded that, but then I was constantly scribing from my phone onto paper, so to make it larger to be able to read. But that's an updated key to the willow flora of Newfoundland. It's actually newer than Flora Nova Anglia. Sorry, Flora of Time, it depends. I feel like the time that we went was good to see the majority of the taxa. It's a compressed season, so for instance, willows are still blooming and primula's blooming and it's July 1st. I think if I wanted to see more Asteraceae and or more Cyperaceae, I would probably go the following month, like late July into early August.
Thank you. We'll do one more question. Do you like exploring the limestone barrens as a general field guide?
Yes, that book was really great. It's because it's a field guide, it can't be comprehensive in terms of the number of flora. But I think for certain groups, like the willows, it had, I think it only had one species that was not present. Yeah, it's a good book. It covers a lot of different groups, animals, fungi as well. But yeah, we took it. We had it with us and used it. Yes.
Just a quick mention that besides the wonderful plants, the people are just really, really fine and completely isolated up there. No roads until sort of, I think it was like 1980 or something, or 70. They got roads. Just really amazing.
We thought the same. The people were really, really nice.
Yeah.
We met some nice locals in Raleigh across from Fern Cave. And it was a couple who was probably in their late 30s, and they grew up there, and they had been away for like 10 years, and they were coming back to visit family, and we just met them on the road in town, not on the reserve, and they asked what we were doing there, and because he said, "Why would you come here?" We said, "Your homeland is beautiful," but he talked about going up there and swimming in the ocean there. Yeah, really nice. Thanks everyone for joining remotely.